June 17th, 1944. 47 hours. 3 kilometers southwest of Saint-Lô, France. Obergefreiter Franz Müller pressed his cheek against the damp earth embankment. His Kar 98K rifle positioned perfectly through the narrow firing port he'd carved into the ancient hedgerow 3 days earlier. The pre-dawn fog hung thick across the small Norman field, reducing visibility to perhaps 30 meters, perfect conditions for what was coming. "Amerikaner," whispered Gefreiter Hans Dietrich from his position 2 meters to Müller's left, where the MG-42 machine gun team had established their primary firing position. "I can hear them moving in the next field." Müller nodded slowly, his finger resting alongside the trigger guard of his rifle. In the 72 hours since his squad from the 352nd Infantry Division had occupied this hedgerow position, they had perfected what German tactical doctrine called Igelstellung, hedgehog defense. Every corner of every field had been registered for mortar fire. Machine gun positions covered the natural approaches. Snipers occupied commanding positions in the twisted oak trees that crowned the earthen walls. The Norman hedgerows, those ancient boundaries of earth and vegetation that divided the French countryside into a patchwork of natural fortresses, had become German killing grounds. The Americans, Müller had been told during the pre-invasion briefings, would advance with their semi-automatic rifles in neat formations. They would expose themselves crossing between fields. They would die in the open ground, cut down by concentrated fire from defenders they couldn't see, positioned behind barriers they couldn't penetrate. The mathematics of hedgerow warfare favored defense so overwhelmingly that Oberst Werner Mühlen, the regimental commander, had declared each field worth a company of defenders in open terrain. Müller had believed him. He had fought in Russia, where German defensive positions had channeled Soviet attacks into killing zones. He had survived Stalingrad's rubble, where every building became a fortress. The hedgerows were simpler, better. The Americans would learn what the Soviets had learned, that attacking prepared German positions meant death. The sounds from the adjacent field grew clearer. Boot steps, the metallic clink of equipment, American voices speaking in low tones. Müller estimated perhaps a squad, maybe 10 men. His own position held 8 soldiers, himself, Dietrich, and his MG-42 team, a sniper named Wilhelm Hoffmann positioned in the oak above, 2 riflemen covering the flanks, and Unteroffizier Kurt Zimmermann commanding from the rear corner where he could direct mortar fire. "They're approaching the gap," Dietrich whispered. 70 meters. The gap was a natural opening in the hedgerow where centuries of farm traffic had worn a path between fields. The Americans would have to use it. The hedgerows themselves were impenetrable walls of earth, some 4 meters thick at the base, crowned with centuries-old vegetation that grew to heights of 5 meters or more. Climbing them meant exposing yourself to fire from 3 sides. The gaps, the lanes between fields, were the only practical routes, and every gap was a trap. Müller tightened his grip on the Kar 98K. The bolt-action rifle held 5 rounds. He could fire perhaps 15 aimed shots per minute if he rushed, though accuracy suffered. The MG-42 beside him could deliver 1,200 rounds per minute in short bursts. The mortar team positioned 2 fields back could drop rounds within seconds of Zimmermann's radio call. This squad of Americans, whoever they were, would survive perhaps 10 seconds after entering the killing zone. Through the fog, Müller saw movement. Shadows resolving into shapes. American helmets, distinctive with their slightly flared brims. Combat uniforms. Equipment harnesses. They were moving carefully, weapons ready, but they were moving toward the gap. Exactly as predicted. Steady. Zimmerman's voice came softly from behind. Let them commit. Mueller watched the Americans approach. One soldier near the front carried something different from the standard M1 Garand rifles. The weapon was shorter, with a distinctive profile Mueller recognized from intelligence briefings and propaganda posters. A Thompson submachine gun. The gangster weapon. The Americans, it seemed, had watched too many of their own movies. Bringing a weapon designed for shooting rivals outside Chicago speakeasies to fight veteran Wehrmacht soldiers in prepared defensive positions. The first American entered the gap, then a second, a third. They were spacing themselves properly, at least, not bunched up like the green troops they'd slaughtered on the beaches. But spacing wouldn't matter. Not here. Not in terrain that negated every American advantage in artillery and air support and reduced warfare to its most primitive form. Who could kill whom first at ranges measured in meters? Now, Zimmerman ordered. Mueller squeezed the trigger. The Kar 98K bucked against his shoulder. The crack of the shot lost immediately in the hammering roar of the MG-42 as Dietrich opened fire. The first American went down. The second threw himself flat. The others scattered, some diving for the base of the hedgerow, others trying to retreat back through the gap. Standard response. Standard tactics. They would return fire, try to suppress the German position, call for support. It would take them minutes to organize an effective response. By then, the mortar rounds would begin falling. The survivors would withdraw. The field would remain German, just as it had remained German yesterday and the day before. Mueller worked his bolt, ejected the spent cartridge, chambered a fresh round. He acquired a target, an American soldier pressed against the base of the hedgerow, trying to bring his rifle to bear. Mueller fired. The soldier jerked and went still. Then Mueller heard something that didn't fit. A sound like fabric tearing. Fast, continuous. Not the measured crack, crack, crack of American M1 rifles firing, but a sustained ripping noise that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The earthen wall around Mueller's firing port exploded in eruptions of dirt and vegetation. Something punched through the space where his head had been a heartbeat earlier. Something else slammed into the thick root mass beside his shoulder. He jerked back from the firing port, confused. The Americans were supposed to be pinned down. They were supposed to be dying in the gap. But the sound continued, that terrible ripping sound. And Mueller realized with growing horror that it wasn't coming from the gap at all. It was coming from both flanks. "They're in the field," Dietrich shouted, his voice barely audible over the sustained fire that was now shredding the hedgerow itself. "They're already—" The sound intensified. Mueller risked a glance through his firing port and saw something that violated every principle of tactical warfare he'd learned. The Americans weren't pinned down in the gap. The Americans weren't trying to suppress his position from cover. The Americans were advancing through the gaps on both flanks of the field, and they were firing as they moved. 3 soldiers with Thompson submachine guns, 1 on each flank and 1 in the center, were hosing down the German defensive position with continuous automatic fire, while other soldiers with M1 rifles moved between bursts. The Thompsons weren't firing aimed shots. They weren't conserving ammunition. They were simply pouring rounds into every suspected firing position, every shadow, every potential threat, creating such a volume of fire that returning fire meant death. Mueller had seen automatic weapons before. He'd faced Soviet PPSH submachine guns in Stalingrad. But those weapons fired the small 7.62mm pistol cartridge, and Soviet tactics emphasized mass charges, not small unit maneuver. These Americans were doing something different. They were using the Thompsons not as defensive weapons, not as last-ditch close-range tools, but as mobile suppression platforms that freed their rifle-armed comrades to advance. The MG-42 fell silent. Mueller glanced left and saw Dietrich slumped over his weapon, blood spreading across his field-gray tunic. The gunner was dead. The assistant gunner was scrambling backward, away from the position that had become a magnet for American fire. Above, in the oak tree, Wilhelm Hoffmann tried to adjust his position. The movement drew immediate attention. All three Thompson gunners swung toward the tree and opened fire simultaneously. Mueller watched in sick fascination as bark and branches exploded under the impact of what must have been 60 or 70 heavy .45 caliber rounds in less than 3 seconds. Hoffmann's body tumbled from the tree, struck multiple times before he hit the ground. "Fall back!" Zimmerman was screaming from the rear of the position. "Fall back to secondary! Positions!" But there was no falling back. The Americans had done something impossible. They'd crossed between fields without bunching up in the gaps, without exposing themselves to concentrated fire. They were in the field now, using the same hedgerows that had protected the Germans to advance under cover. And those terrible weapons, those gangster guns from Chicago speakeasies and Hollywood movies, were creating such continuous fire that German soldiers couldn't stay in position long enough to aim, let alone shoot. Mueller grabbed his rifle and scrambled backward, keeping low. The two flank riflemen were already running, abandoning their positions. Zimmerman was trying to reach the radio to call for mortar support, but the Americans were closing too fast. The engagement that was supposed to last minutes was collapsing in seconds. Another burst of Thompson fire raked the position. Mueller felt something tug at his tunic, then burning pain across his ribs. He kept moving, driven by pure survival instinct. Behind him, he heard Zimmerman's scream cut short. He didn't look back. Mueller reached the gap in the rear hedgerow, the escape route they'd prepared. He threw himself through it and rolled into the next field, where Hauptmann Klaus Becker's reserve squad was supposed to be positioned. But the reserve position was empty. Either they'd already been overrun, or they'd withdrawn when they heard the Thompson fire. That sound, that terrible, distinctive sound, like a typewriter operated by a madman, like fabric being torn at impossible speed. It wasn't the deep hammer of the MG-42. It wasn't the crack of rifle fire. It was something else entirely. The sound of continuous, overwhelming firepower, delivered by a weapon light enough to be fired while moving, reliable enough to function without jamming, and chambered in a round heavy enough to punch through the vegetation and earthen walls that made hedgerows such formidable defenses. Mueller pressed himself into the base of the hedgerow and forced himself to think. His position, prepared over 3 days, perfectly sighted according to German defensive doctrine, had fallen in less than 2 minutes. His squad was dead or scattered. The Americans were in the field, and they were doing something fundamentally different from what German tactics had anticipated. They weren't trying to suppress German positions from a distance. They were closing immediately, using continuous automatic fire from multiple weapons to make returning fire suicidal, then advancing while German soldiers were forced to keep their heads down. The Thompsons created such volume of fire that they didn't need to aim precisely. They just needed to pour rounds into suspected positions until defenders either died or fled. In the pre-dawn quiet that followed the American advance through his former position, Mueller could hear similar sounds from adjacent fields. The distinctive ripping sound of Thompson submachine guns, repeated again and again as American squads cleared hedgerow after hedgerow using tactics the Germans had not anticipated and could not counter with bolt-action rifles and defensive doctrine designed for different terrain. What Müller didn't know, what none of the German defenders scattered across the Norman hedgerows could have imagined, was that they were facing a weapon that had been specifically designed for exactly this type of fighting. The Thompson submachine gun, developed 30 years earlier as a trench broom for close-quarters combat in the First World War, had found its perfect battlefield in the maze-like terrain of Normandy, where American industry's capacity to produce 1.7 million of them would overwhelm German defensive tactics refined on the Eastern Front. The Gangster gun, it turned out, was about to clear German fortresses faster than any weapon in American arsenal, and soldiers like Müller, who had survived Stalingrad and believed hedgerow defense was invincible, were about to learn that when Americans brought Chicago to Normandy, defensive doctrine died at 600 rounds per minute. The weapon that shattered Franz Müller's defensive position that June morning had been born from the stalemate of another war, in trenches that bore uncomfortable resemblance to the hedgerow fields of Normandy. In 1917, as American doughboys prepared to enter the meat grinder of the Western Front, Brigadier General John Taliaferro Thompson confronted a problem that had killed millions: how to give individual soldiers enough firepower to survive the close-quarters brutality of trench warfare. The rifles of 1917 were magnificent instruments of precision. The German Mauser, the British Lee Enfield, the American Springfield, all could deliver accurate fire at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. But in the trenches, where men fought at distances measured in meters, where combat happened in confined spaces choked with barbed wire and mud, these 5-foot-long rifles with their bayonets attached became unwieldy clubs. Soldiers needed something different, something that could sweep an enemy trench clear in seconds. Thompson, a West Point graduate who had spent his career in the Army Ordnance Department, envisioned what he called a trench broom, a one-man machine gun, light enough to be carried and fired by a single soldier, powerful enough to dominate close-quarters combat. He formed the Auto Ordnance Corporation in 1916, recruited engineers Theodore Eickhoff and Oscar Payne, and set them to work creating something that had never existed before. The technical challenge was formidable. Machine guns of the era required water cooling, heavy barrels, and complex mechanisms. They weighed 50 pounds or more and needed crews to operate. Thompson's team needed to create something an individual soldier could carry while also carrying ammunition, grenades, and all the other equipment of modern warfare. The solution came from an unlikely source. Commander John Bell Blish of the United States Navy had patented a delayed blowback system that used friction between dissimilar metals to slow the bolt's rearward movement after firing. Thompson incorporated this Blish lock into his design, paired it with the .45 ACP cartridge already used in the Army's M1911 pistol, and created a weapon that would change infantry combat forever. By 1918, the prototype was ready. Engineers at the Auto Ordnance Facility in Cleveland, Ohio, had produced a working model they called the Annihilator I. The gun weighed just over 10 pounds. It fired from a closed bolt using simple blowback operation. It could empty a 20-round magazine in less than 2 seconds. On the test range, observers watched in awe as the Thompson gun, as it was quickly named, chewed through wooden targets at rates no individual rifleman could match. But the armistice came on November 11, 1918, just 2 days before crates of Annihilator prototypes were to be shipped to France. The war ended before Thompson's trench broom could sweep any trenches. The guns remained in their crates at the New York docks for weeks before being returned to the factory. The weapon designed to break the stalemate of the Western Front never fired a shot in anger. What followed was nearly 2 decades of commercial and military indifference punctuated by spectacular misuse. The Auto Ordnance Corporation, having invested heavily in development, needed to recoup costs. They contracted with Colt Patent Firearms to manufacture 15,000 model 1921 Thompson submachine guns. Each gun cost about $200, more than a Ford Model T, more than most workers earned in a month. At that price, military sales proved impossible in the budget-starved peacetime army. The Thompson found other buyers. The United States Postal Service purchased some to protect mail trains from armed robbery. The Marine Corps bought a few hundred for use in the banana wars of Central America, where they proved devastatingly effective in jungle ambushes. Police departments in major cities acquired small numbers. And then came the buyers that would define the Thompson's reputation for a generation, the gangsters of Prohibition America. The Thompson submachine gun became the Chicago Typewriter, the weapon of choice for organized crime. The Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929, where 7 men were murdered with Thompson guns, made headlines worldwide. Bank robbers like John Dillinger wielded Thompsons. Bootleggers used them to settle territorial disputes. Hollywood immortalized the weapon in countless crime films, always in the hands of men in pinstripe suits and fedoras. By 1938, when war clouds gathered over Europe, the Thompson had become synonymous with criminality in the American public imagination. When the United States Army finally adopted the weapon, redesignating the improved Model 1928A1 as a standard submachine gun, they did so reluctantly. Military planners worried about the gun's gangster associations. Would American soldiers take seriously a weapon that had become a prop in gangster movies? The soldiers took it very seriously indeed. They just had to wait for the right war. The Germans, watching American military developments through their intelligence apparatus, dismissed the Thompson as evidence of American military weakness. A submachine gun firing pistol-caliber ammunition. Appropriate perhaps for police work or criminal activity, but hardly a serious military weapon. The Wehrmacht relied on the bolt-action Kar 98K rifle as its standard infantry weapon, a magnificent piece of engineering that could deliver accurate fire at 600 meters. German squad tactics built around the MG-34 and later MG-42 machine guns provided automatic fire when needed. Individual soldiers didn't need submachine guns. That was the domain of rear echelon troops and vehicle crews. The German MP-38 and MP-40 submachine guns, produced in large numbers, were considered auxiliary weapons. They fired the 9mm Parabellum cartridge, a lighter round than the Thompson's .45 ACP. They were issued primarily to officers, vehicle crews, and paratroopers. The idea of regular infantry squads built around submachine gun firepower seemed wasteful, undisciplined, very American. This assessment wasn't entirely wrong. The Thompson had significant drawbacks that German intelligence correctly identified. At over 10 pounds empty, it was heavier than most rifles. It was expensive to manufacture. Each gun required extensive machining, high-quality materials, and skilled labor. The elaborate Blish locking system, while theoretically sophisticated, added complexity without significant benefit. The weapon was effective only at short range, perhaps 50 to 75 yards maximum. Beyond that, the heavy .45 caliber bullet dropped rapidly and accuracy suffered. German tactical doctrine, refined through years of combat in Russia, emphasized long-range rifle fire supported by machine guns. Infantry engaged at distances of 200 to 400 meters when possible. Close combat was what happened when tactics failed, when defenses were breached, when situations became desperate. Building military doctrine around a weapon effective only at close range seemed backwards. What the Germans failed to understand was that American industrial logic operated differently. Yes, the Thompson was expensive, but American industry could produce expensive weapons in quantities that made cost per unit irrelevant. Yes, it was heavy, but American soldiers were generally larger and better fed than their German counterparts, and could handle the weight. Yes, it was effective only at short range, but American tactical doctrine increasingly emphasized combined arms coordination, where infantry wouldn't need to engage at long range. Artillery and air power would handle that. Most importantly, the Germans failed to anticipate that there would be battlefields where close-range combat wasn't a tactical failure, but an inevitable condition. Battlefields like the Hedgerows of Normandy. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, the Army placed massive orders for Thompson submachine guns. Auto Ordnance, still lacking adequate manufacturing facilities, contracted with Savage Arms Corporation in Utica, New York, to produce the weapons. By early 1942, 500,000 Thompsons had been manufactured. Production continued to accelerate, but the Thompson's complexity and cost remained problems. In 1942, Army Ordnance engineers undertook a systematic redesign to simplify production. They eliminated the Blish lock. Tests proved it unnecessary for the relatively low-pressure 45 ACP cartridge. They replaced the finely adjustable Lyman rear sight with a simple stamped L-shaped peep sight. They removed the barrel cooling fins and the cuts compensator. They replaced the vertical forward grip with a simple horizontal stock. The result was the M1 Thompson, adopted in April 1942, followed by the even simpler M1A1. These wartime variants sacrificed the craftsmanship and elegant engineering of earlier models, but they could be produced faster and cheaper. The M1A1 cost $45 to manufacture, less than a quarter of the original Model 1921's price. More importantly, it was just as reliable and just as deadly in combat. By 1944, American factories were producing Thompsons at rates that would have seemed impossible just 3 years earlier. Savage Arms alone produced over 1.25 million guns during the war. Auto Ordnance's factory in Bridgeport, Connecticut, built from a converted brake shoe plant, produced over 200,000 more. Total wartime production exceeded 1.7 million Thompson submachine guns, more automatic weapons of a single type than any army in history had fielded. The weapon was issued preferentially to specialized units. Rangers received Thompsons. Paratroopers carried them on jumps. The compact M1A1 fit better in aircraft than the longer M1 Garand rifle. Tank crews kept them for close-in defense. Military police valued them for prisoner handling. Infantry squad leaders and scouts often carried them instead of rifles. But the Thompson's true value wouldn't become apparent until American soldiers encountered terrain where its characteristics, short range, high volume of fire, reliability, and devastating stopping power, turned from limitations into decisive advantages. Terrain where visibility was measured in meters, where combat happened at distances where you could see the enemy's eyes, where the ability to deliver continuous automatic fire for 3 or 4 seconds could mean the difference between life and death. Terrain like the ancient hedgerows of Normandy, France, where centuries-old farm boundaries had created a landscape perfectly suited to defensive warfare, where German tactical doctrine had created killing zones in every field, where bolt-action rifles and carefully aimed fire met their match in American soldiers carrying weapons designed to sweep trenches, now clearing hedgerows at 600 rounds per minute. The Germans had laughed at the Gangster gun. They had dismissed it as evidence of American lack of military seriousness. They had assumed their superior tactical doctrine and superior individual rifle marksmanship would prevail. They hadn't counted on Chicago coming to Normandy. and in the fog-shrouded fields southwest of Saint-Lô, in hedgerow-enclosed killing zones that German defenders had spent months preparing, the Chicago Typewriter was about to write a new chapter in infantry warfare, one burst at a time. June 18, 1944. 1,347 hours. The village of La Chapelle-en-Jugère, 8 kilometers west of Saint-Lô. Sergeant Robert Bobby Nolan of Company C, 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Infantry Division, crouched at the base of a hedgerow and studied the field ahead through a gap in the vegetation. His Thompson M1A1 rested across his knees, the 30-round magazine seated, the bolt forward. Sweat ran down his face despite the cool Norman afternoon. They'd been clearing hedgerows for 12 days straight, and Nolan had learned more about close-quarters combat in those 12 days than in 2 years of training. "What do you see, Sarge?" Private First Class Jimmy Castellano whispered from behind him. The kid from Brooklyn was 20 years old, carried an M1 Garand, and had the jittery energy of someone who'd seen too much death in too short a time. "Another field," Nolan replied quietly. "Another hedgerow. Another group of krauts waiting to kill us if we're stupid about it." The hedgerow ahead was typical. An earthen embankment, perhaps 3 meters high, overgrown with centuries of oak and bramble, creating a wall that was effectively impenetrable except at the gaps where farm paths cut through. German doctrine was to position machine guns covering those gaps, with riflemen and snipers supporting. Any squad trying to rush through the opening would be massacred. Standard American tactics called for artillery preparation, then infantry assault with rifle fire. But artillery in the hedgerows was problematic. The thick vegetation and earth absorbed much of the blast, and you couldn't see where shells were landing anyway. And rifle fire, even from the excellent M1 Garand, wasn't enough to suppress defenders you couldn't see, positioned behind cover you couldn't penetrate. Nolan had learned a different way, a way that his platoon leader, Lieutenant William Fletcher, had figured out after losing half his men in the first 3 days, a way that centered around the Thompson submachine gun Nolan carried and the 2 other Thompsons in their 12-man squad. "Okay, listen up," Nolan said softly. His squad gathered close. "Castellano, you and Rodriguez with your Garands. You're going to put fire through that gap ahead. Not aimed fire. Just keep rounds going through there every few seconds. Make them think you're fixing to rush it." The 2 riflemen nodded. They'd done this before. "Martinez," Nolan continued, looking at Corporal Eddie Martinez, who carried the squad's 2nd Thompson. "You take Harris and Wilson and work your way left to that gap in the flank hedgerow. Give us 3 minutes to get in position on the right." Martinez grinned. The stocky kid from El Paso had taken to the Thompson like he'd been born with one. "Just like Brooklyn, right, Sarge?" "Just like Brooklyn," Nolan confirmed, though he'd never been to Brooklyn and had no idea if clearing New York tenements was anything like clearing Norman hedgerows. "When you hear my Thompson open up, you hit them from your side. Pour it on. Don't stop until your mag's empty." "What about me, Sergeant?" Private Daniel Morrison asked. Morrison carried the squad's Browning automatic rifle, the Bar, a 20-pound monster that could deliver sustained automatic fire. "You're our hammer," Nolan said. "Once Martinez and I light them up, you find their machine gun position and pound it. Then we all move forward together before they can regroup." Nolan turned to the last member of his fire team. "Jackson, you're with me. Stay low, move fast, and if I go down, you pick up the Thompson and keep firing. Understood?" Private First Class Leonard Jackson, a former factory worker from Detroit, who'd proven himself steady under fire, nodded grimly. "Understood, Sarge." They synchronized watches. Nolan took his three-man team and began working their way along the base of the hedgerow toward the right flank. The vegetation was thick enough to provide concealment if they stayed low. Above them, birds sang in the oak trees, oblivious to the violence about to unfold. 3 minutes. Nolan counted it down in his head as they moved. He could hear Castellano and Rodriguez beginning their suppression fire. Single shots from their Garans, spaced a few seconds apart, snapping through the gap in the hedgerow ahead. Return fire came immediately. The distinctive sound of a German MG-42, the Hitler's buzzsaw, ripping out 1,200 rounds per minute in short bursts, exactly as expected. Nolan reached the flank gap. Through the opening, he could see Mbuso into the next field. It was perhaps 50 meters across, bordered by hedgerows on all sides. Somewhere in the far hedgerow, the Germans were positioned. He couldn't see them. That was the whole point of hedgerow defense. You couldn't see the enemy until you were in the killing zone. But Nolan didn't need to see them. He just needed to make them keep their heads down. He checked his Thompson one more time. Bolt forward, safety off, magazine secure. The weapon was heavier than a rifle, bulkier, harder to aim precisely. But in the close quarters chaos of hedgerow fighting, precision didn't matter. Volume of fire mattered. The psychological impact of continuous automatic fire mattered. Making the enemy unable to return fire mattered. From across the field, Nolan heard Martinez's Thompson open up. The distinctive sound, faster than the German MG-42's bursts, sustained longer, that ripping fabric sound that had earned the weapon its Chicago Typewriter nickname. Martinez was pouring fire into the German position from the left flank. Nolan stepped through the gap and into the field. He brought the Thompson up to his shoulder, aimed at the hedgerow 70 meters ahead, where muzzle flashes had revealed the German position, and squeezed the trigger. The Thompson roared to life. The recoil was substantial but manageable. The weapon's 10-pound weight absorbed much of it. Nolan held the trigger down, sweeping the barrel slightly left to right, hosing the entire suspected German position with 45 caliber rounds, 30 rounds in less than 4 seconds. He couldn't see what he was hitting, but that wasn't the point. The point was to create such a volume of fire that returning fire became impossible. Behind him, Jackson was already moving forward. Nolan ejected the empty magazine, pulled a fresh one from his webbing, and slammed it home. He fired another burst, shorter this time, then moved forward himself. The key was never to stop moving, never to give the Germans time to aim, never to let them recover from the shock of facing continuous automatic fire from multiple directions. Across the field, Martinez was doing the same. The sound of the two Thompsons firing in concert created a continuous wall of sound. Morrison's bar joined in, the heavier 20-round bursts pounding the hedgerow where the German machine gun had been positioned. Nolan advanced 20 meters, fired another burst, advanced again. The German return fire had slackened dramatically. Either they were suppressed, wounded, or pulling back. Nolan didn't know which and didn't care. He just kept moving, kept firing, kept pushing forward. Then he saw them. 2 German soldiers breaking from cover, running for the rear gap in their hedgerow. One carried a rifle. The other was trying to drag an ammunition box. Nolan swung the Thompson toward them and fired. At 40 meters, the 45 caliber rounds were devastating. The first German went down immediately. The second dropped the ammunition box and raised his hands. "Jackson, prisoner!" Nolan shouted, then kept moving toward the hedgerow. They had to secure it before the Germans could regroup. He reached the earthen wall and pressed himself against it, breathing hard. Martinez and his team were converging from the left. Morrison and the bar team were advancing across the open field. Castellano and Rodriguez, their suppression task complete, were moving up. "Clear!" Martinez called out, his Thompson sweeping the abandoned German position. "They hauled ass, Sarge. Must have been 6 or 7 of them." Nolan examined the position. It was textbook German defense. Machine gun pit dug into the embankment, overhead cover from logs and earth. Firing ports cut precisely to cover the gaps. Spent MG-42 brass littered the ground. Blood spatters showed where at least one of Martinez's bursts had connected. But the position had been abandoned in seconds once the Americans got flanking fire on it with the Thompsons. "Sarge, you need to see this," Castellano called from 30 meters away. He was standing over the body of a German soldier. When Nolan reached him, he understood why Castellano looked shaken. The German, a young kid, couldn't have been more than 19, had been hit multiple times by .45 caliber rounds. The wounds were massive. The Thompson's heavy bullets, designed to stop determined attackers at close range, had punched through the soldier's torso with devastating effect. His rifle lay nearby, unfired. "Jesus Christ," Castellano whispered. "He never got a shot off." "That's the point," Nolan said quietly. "That's the whole goddamn point, Jimmy. We hit them so fast, with so much fire, they can't fight back. I'd rather see this than see you lying there with a German bullet in you." But even as he said it, Nolan understood what made the Thompsons so effective in the Hedgerows. It wasn't just the rate of fire, or the reliability, or even the stopping power. It was the psychological impact. German soldiers, no matter how well trained or experienced, couldn't maintain defensive positions when facing continuous automatic fire from multiple directions. The human brain couldn't process it. You either returned fire and died, or you ran and maybe lived. The Germans had built their defensive doctrine around superior training, superior marksmanship, and superior tactical positioning. But when American squads could pour 600 rounds per minute into German positions from weapons light enough to fire while moving, training and marksmanship didn't matter. You couldn't aim if you couldn't raise your head without getting it shot off. "Lieutenant's on the horn," Morrison called out, holding up the squad radio. "Says we're to hold here and prepare to advance on the next field in 15 minutes. Battalion's moving up on our left." Nolan nodded. 15 minutes to rest, reload, check equipment. He sat down with his back against the hedgerow and began the ritual of reloading magazines. Each 30-round magazine had to be filled by hand, pressing each 45 ACP round down against the spring tension. It was tedious work, but the alternative was running out of ammunition when you needed it most. Around him, the squad was settling into the captured position. Castellano was helping Jackson with the German prisoner, a frightened-looking kid who kept babbling something in German. Martinez was cleaning his Thompson, running a patch through the barrel. Morrison was eating a chocolate bar from his K-ration, somehow maintaining his appetite despite everything they'd just done. "Sarge," Jackson said, walking over. "The prisoner keeps saying something. Sounds like Typewriter or something. You speak any German?" Nolan listened to the German kid's frantic words. "Schreibmaschine. Schreibmaschine." The kid pointed at the Thompsons, his hands shaking. "Typewriter," Nolan said slowly. "He's calling the Thompson a typewriter." Martinez laughed. "Chicago typewriter. Even the Krauts know it." But the German kid wasn't laughing. He was terrified. His eyes kept darting to the Thompsons, and he flinched whenever one of the Americans moved. Nolan realized that to this soldier, Fresh from the Eastern Front, where German tactical superiority had been gospel, the Thompson represented something incomprehensible. A weapon that made defensive positions useless. A weapon that turned German veterans into panicked refugees in seconds. "How many fields we cleared today, Sarge?" Morrison asked, still chewing his chocolate. Nolan had to think about it. 6, no, 7. 7 fields since dawn. 7 fields that would have taken a week using conventional tactics. 7 German defensive positions overrun in a single day. All because Lieutenant Fletcher had figured out what the Germans hadn't. That in terrain where visibility was limited to 50 meters, where combat happened at ranges where you could see the enemy's uniform buttons, rate of fire mattered more than accuracy. Suppression mattered more than marksmanship, and a 10-pound submachine gun firing 600 rounds per minute mattered more than a 4-pound rifle firing 15 rounds per minute. The Germans had studied warfare for centuries. They had created tactical doctrines based on precise analysis of countless battles. They had trained their soldiers to standards that American troops couldn't match. They had built the hedgerow defenses to maximize every advantage their superior training provided. And then American industry had given its soldiers a weapon that made German training irrelevant. A weapon designed by a general who'd never seen combat, refined by engineers in Cleveland, mass-produced in quantities that would have seemed impossible to German planners, and wielded by 20-year-old kids from Brooklyn and Detroit and El Paso who'd learned to use it through brutal trial and error in the worst infantry combat terrain in Europe. 15 minutes up, Martinez said, checking his watch. Next field? Nolan stood, shouldered his Thompson, and nodded. Next field. They'd clear it the same way they'd cleared the last 7. 2 Thompsons on the flanks, continuous fire, rapid advance. The Germans would either die in their positions or abandon them. Either way, the field would be American in minutes. And somewhere across the Norman countryside, other squads with other Thompsons were clearing other fields. The Germans called it the Chicago Typewriter, and they were right. It was typing the death warrant of their hedgerow defenses, one burst at a time. The Gangster gun had come to France, and every German soldier who'd laughed at the weapon from Hollywood movies, who'd dismissed it as evidence of American military unseriousness, was learning what Chicago gangsters had known since 1929. When a Thompson opens fire, you either run or you die. There was no third option. The transformation of German attitudes toward the Thompson submachine gun didn't happen overnight. It evolved through blood and failure across the Norman countryside in the summer of 1944, spreading from unit to unit like a contagion of fear. What began as mockery in early June had become doctrine-shattering terror by late July. Hauptmann Wilhelm Richter of the 716th Infantry Division had been among the skeptics. A veteran of the Eastern Front, where German tactical superiority had been unquestioned, Richter arrived in Normandy confident that American soldiers with their gangster weapons posed no serious threat to properly trained Wehrmacht troops. His after-action report from June 28th, recovered from German archives, revealed how quickly that confidence evaporated. "The Americans have developed tactics we did not anticipate," Richter wrote. "They use their submachine guns not as support weapons but as the primary assault tool. Our defensive positions, designed to maximize our riflemen's marksmanship advantage, become death traps when the Americans achieve flanking positions with these weapons. The volume of fire is overwhelming. Men cannot return fire. They cannot aim. They can only die or retreat." The statistics compiled by German intelligence were sobering. By mid-July, American forces in Normandy were fielding approximately 1 Thompson for every 12 soldiers, a ratio that seemed impossible to German quartermasters accustomed to rationing every bullet. The U.S. Army was burning through 2.5 million rounds of 45 ACP ammunition weekly in the Hedgerow fighting. Each Thompson-equipped squad was carrying 600 to 900 rounds into combat, enough for sustained firefights that German doctrine said shouldn't exist. Oberst Franz Weller, commanding the remnants of the 352nd Infantry Division, the same unit that had bloodied American forces on Omaha Beach, documented the tactical revolution in real time. His field notes, captured when his headquarters was overrun near St. Lo, showed a commander watching his army's advantages evaporate. July 3rd, Americans continue using automatic weapons in unprecedented volumes. Our men report being unable to establish proper defensive positions before being overwhelmed by fire. July 8th, requested additional MG-42s to counter American firepower. Request denied. No reserves available. Meanwhile, Americans seem to have unlimited submachine guns. July 14th, traditional tactics failing completely. Americans suppress our positions with automatic weapons while maneuvering freely. Our riflemen, the best trained in the world, are combat ineffective against this volume of fire. July 19th, have ordered all units to abandon standard hedgerow defense. New orders. Withdraw immediately when Americans achieve flanking position with automatic weapons. Better to lose ground than lose men to these killing machines. The Thompson's psychological impact extended beyond just the soldiers who faced it. Letters home, despite heavy censorship, revealed the growing demoralization. Gefreiter Ernst Hoffmann wrote to his wife in Hamburg, "The Americans fight differently than the Russians. The Russians came in masses we could mow down. The Americans come with weapons that mow us down. They have machine pistols that never stop firing. We call them typewriters because of the sound. When you hear that sound, you run or you die." The weapon was transforming more than just tactics. It was destroying the mythology of German military superiority. The Wehrmacht had built its identity on professional soldiering, on the idea that superior training and discipline could overcome material disadvantages. But in the Hedgerows, an American teenager with 3 weeks of combat experience and a Thompson could neutralize a German veteran with 3 years on the Eastern Front. Lieutenant James Patterson of the 29th Infantry Division, whose unit had suffered terribly on D-Day, found grim satisfaction in the reversal. In a letter to his father, a World War I veteran, he wrote, "Dad, you told me about trench warfare, about machine guns making attack impossible. Here it's reversed. Our Thompsons make defense impossible. The Germans can't hold any position once we get close enough to use them effectively. They know it, we know it, and the knowledge is breaking them." The American adoption of the Thompson for hedgerow fighting wasn't uniform or immediate. It had evolved through brutal trial and error in the first weeks after D-Day. Initially, many American units had tried to fight the hedgerows using conventional tactics. Artillery preparation followed by rifle-armed infantry advances. The casualties were horrendous. The 2nd Infantry Division lost 1,200 men in 5 days, trying to advance 3 miles using traditional methods. But American flexibility, derided by German officers as unmilitary improvisation, proved decisive. Squad and platoon leaders like Sergeant Nolan began developing new tactics on their own initiative. Word spread through the informal networks that exist in all armies. Get more Thompsons. Hit them from the flanks. Never stop moving. Pour on the fire. Within weeks, what had started as desperate improvisation became standard operating procedure. The U.S. Army, recognizing the Thompson's effectiveness, began emergency redistribution of weapons. Thompsons intended for rear area security troops Military police and tank crews were reassigned to infantry units. By late July, some rifle companies had managed to acquire one Thompson for every squad, triple the authorized allocation. Nobody questioned the unauthorized reorganization. Results spoke louder than regulations. Meanwhile, German attempts to counter the Thompson revealed their deteriorating situation. The Wehrmacht's answer to the Thompson should have been the MP-40 submachine gun, an excellent weapon that had proven itself from Poland to Russia. But the MP-40 fired 9mm ammunition, lacking the Thompson's stopping power. More critically, Germany simply didn't have enough of them. While America had produced 1.7 million Thompsons, Germany managed only 1 million MP-40s for all theaters across 6 years of war. Unteroffizier Karl Becker of the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, experienced this disparity firsthand during the fighting around Caen. His unit, supposedly elite troops with priority for equipment, had 1 MP-40 per squad. They faced Americans' units where 3 or 4 men carried Thompsons. "We were supposed to be the superior soldiers," Becker recalled in a post-war interview. "But superior soldiering means nothing when the enemy can put 10 bullets in the air for every one of yours." The disparity went beyond just numbers. American Thompsons were maintained with abundant spare parts, cleaned with proper supplies, and fed match-grade ammunition manufactured to precise specifications. German weapons, by mid-1944, were maintained with whatever was available, cleaned with gasoline when oil ran out, and fed ammunition that varied wildly in quality. Master Sergeant Robert Daniels, a weapons specialist with the 1st Infantry Division, documented the difference after examining captured German equipment. Their rifles were well maintained. You could tell the German soldiers cared for them like their lives depended on it, which they did. But they had no oil, no proper cleaning supplies, patches made from torn uniforms. Meanwhile, we were throwing away cleaning kits because we had too many. Every Thompson had spare parts, spare magazines, all the ammunition you could carry. It wasn't a fair fight. The Thompson's impact reached beyond infantry combat. Tank crews began carrying them for self-defense after dismounting. Engineers used them to clear defensive positions before placing demolition charges. Artillery forward observers carried them for protection when calling in fire missions. Even medics, technically non-combatants, began carrying Thompsons for defensive purposes only. Technical Sergeant William Cole, a combat engineer with the 101st Airborne Division, used a Thompson to single-handedly clear a German position blocking a causeway near Carentan, action that earned him the Medal of Honor. "The Thompson was perfect for the job," Cole said later. "I could fire while moving, keep their heads down, get close enough to throw satchel charges. Try doing that with a rifle." The German response evolved from dismissal to respect to something approaching panic. By late July, Wehrmacht intelligence was issuing urgent bulletins about American automatic weapons tactics. Enemy employs submachine guns in unprecedented numbers. All units must assume American infantry possesses multiple automatic weapons. Defensive positions must account for suppressive fire from multiple angles. Traditional tactics are obsolete. But knowing the problem and solving it were different things. The German army in Normandy was trapped in a death spiral. They couldn't match American firepower, couldn't replace their losses, couldn't adapt their tactics fast enough. Every day brought more American divisions with more Thompsons and unlimited ammunition. General Lieutenant Dietrich Kreis, commanding the 352nd Infantry Division, until his death from wounds on August 2nd, wrote one of the last assessments of American tactics. "We are not fighting the American Army of 1918 or even 1943. These are not the soldiers we expected. Poorly trained conscripts with theoretical knowledge but no practical skill. These are men armed with weapons that multiply their effectiveness tenfold, supported by unlimited ammunition, adapting tactics daily. They have turned our defensive advantages into traps. The hedgerow fighting reached its climax during Operation Cobra, the American breakout offensive beginning July 25th. After devastating aerial bombardment, American infantry poured through German lines. Thompson's in the lead, overwhelming defensive positions that had held for 7 weeks. German units that had fought tenaciously in June simply collapsed, their will broken by weeks of facing automatic weapons they couldn't match. Feldwebel Heinrich Gross, one of the few survivors of the 352nd Infantry Division's final stand, described the breakthrough. The Americans came through our lines like water through a broken dam. Every squad had multiple automatic weapons. The sound was incredible. Hundreds of those typewriters all firing at once. We had perhaps 60 men left from a regiment of 2,000. We fired a few shots and ran. What else could we do? Stand and die for nothing? The pursuit across France that followed Cobra demonstrated the Thompsons' versatility beyond the hedgerows. American mechanized infantry, riding on tanks and trucks, used Thompsons to spray German positions while moving at speed. The weapon that had been mocked as a gangster's gun proved perfect for the mobile warfare that characterized the race across France. By August 1944, even elite German units were modifying their tactics to account for American automatic weapons superiority. The 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, among Germany's best units, issued new defensive guidelines. When facing American infantry, assume they possess 3 to 4 automatic weapons per squad. Do not attempt to hold positions once Americans achieve fire superiority. Withdraw immediately to prevent encirclement. These were not the orders of a confident military force. These were the admissions of an army that had lost the infantry firepower battle completely. The Wehrmacht, that had pioneered modern infantry tactics, that had written the textbooks other armies studied, was reduced to telling its men to run when they heard Thompson's firing. The statistics from the Normandy campaign told the story in stark numbers. American forces in Normandy expended approximately 100 million rounds of .45 ACP ammunition in 2 months of fighting. Thompson-equipped units reported kill ratios of 6-1 or better in hedgerow combat. German casualty reports consistently noted overwhelming automatic weapons fire as the primary cause of death and wounds. But perhaps the most telling statistic was the simplest. In June 1944, German forces in Normandy outnumbered American forces. By August, despite constant American reinforcement, German forces had suffered such casualties that they were outnumbered 3-1. The hedgerow fighting hadn't just delayed the German army, it had destroyed it. The Thompson submachine gun hadn't won the Battle of Normandy by itself, but in the unique terrain of the Norman countryside, where visibility was measured in meters and combat was intensely personal, it had proven the perfect weapon. It gave American soldiers, many in combat for the first time, a decisive advantage over veteran German troops. As August turned to September and American forces approached the German border, the lessons of Normandy spread through the entire Wehrmacht. The Americans weren't military amateurs playing at war with gangster weapons. They were an industrial democracy that had turned mass production into mass destruction, that had given their soldiers weapons the German military-industrial complex couldn't match, and that had adapted tactics to maximize those weapons' effectiveness. The gangster gun had become the liberator's tool, and every burst of .45 caliber fire that echoed across the Norman countryside had typed another line in the obituary of the Third Reich. The Typewriter had written the story of German defeat, one 30-round magazine at a time. The numbers told a story that German military planners could never have imagined when they dismissed the Thompson as a gangster's toy. By war's end, American factories had produced 1,750,000 Thompson submachine guns. Not variants or different models counted together. 1.75 million of a single weapon system, manufactured to exacting specifications, each one capable of laying down the devastating fire that had shattered German defensive doctrine in Normandy. The production story itself revealed the chasm between American and German industrial philosophy. While German factories crafted MP40s with careful attention to minimizing material usage and manufacturing time, American production lines at Auto Ordnance in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and Savage Arms in Utica, New York, pursued a different goal: absolute reliability through overwhelming quality. Each Thompson M1A1 required 14 pounds of steel, precisely machined. The receiver alone went through 27 separate machining operations. The bolt required tool steel hardened to exact specifications. The barrel was hand-fitted to tolerances of 1/10,000th of an inch. German engineers examining captured Thompsons consistently remarked on what they considered wasteful over-engineering. They missed the point entirely. Colonel James Harriman, who supervised Thompson production at Savage Arms, explained the philosophy in a post-war interview. Could we have made them cheaper? Absolutely. Could we have made them faster with looser tolerances? Sure. But we weren't building guns for accountants. We were building guns for 20-year-old kids who needed them to work every single time in the mud of Italy, the sand of Africa, the hedgerows of France. An extra pound of steel, an extra hour of machining, that meant some kid came home alive. The ammunition production was equally staggering. Western Cartridge Company and Remington produced 3.5 billion rounds of 45 ACP ammunition during the war. That's 2,000 rounds for every Thompson manufactured, enough to keep every weapon firing continuously in combat. German soldiers who surrendered often remarked that Americans fired more ammunition in a single engagement than German units received in a month. But the true measure of the Thompson's impact came from those who faced it. In 1967, 23 years after D-Day, the German veterans magazine Der Lancer published a special issue on weapons that changed the war. The Thompson submachine gun received its own chapter, written by former Wehrmacht officers who had faced it in combat. Major Hans Becker, who had commanded a battalion in Normandy, wrote, "The Thompson represented something we Germans failed to understand about American warfare. We focused on precision, on marksmanship, on making every bullet count because bullets were precious. The Americans focused on volume, on suppression, on overwhelming firepower because they could afford to." When you heard that sound, that distinctive rapid hammering, you knew you were facing an enemy who could afford to miss with 50 bullets because they had 500 more. The testimonies gathered for the article were remarkably consistent. Oberst Wilhelm von Steuben. The psychological effect was devastating. Our best marksmen, men who could hit targets at 400 meters, were rendered useless by American soldiers spraying bullets from 50 meters. Hauptmann Friedrich Zimmermann. We called it the Chicago piano because of the sound. When multiple Thompsons fired together, it created a wall of sound and lead that made resistance impossible. Lieutenant Georg Müller. In the Hedgerows, the Thompson negated every advantage we had. Training, experience, defensive positions. None of it mattered when Americans could simply hose down your position with automatic fire while advancing. The impact extended beyond just those who had faced the Thompson in combat. The weapon had become a symbol of American industrial might that haunted German military thinking for decades. At the Führungsakademie der Bundeswehr, the German military academy established after the war, the Normandy campaign was studied extensively. The Thompson's role in breaking German hedgerow defenses became a standard case study in how technology and tactics could combine to overthrow established military doctrine. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of German armored warfare, wrote in his memoirs, "We prepared for a war where battles would be won by superior training and tactics. The Americans fought a war where battles were won by superior firepower and logistics. The Thompson submachine gun epitomized this approach, a weapon that required no special skill to employ effectively, produced in quantities we couldn't imagine, supplied with ammunition we couldn't match." The Thompson's influence extended far beyond World War II. Every major military in the world studied the Normandy hedgerow battles and drew the same conclusion. In close-quarters combat, volume of fire trumped accuracy. The assault rifle, which would dominate infantry combat for the next century, was essentially an attempt to give every infantryman the firepower that in 1944 only Thompson gunners possessed. Veterans' reunions throughout the decades provided more personal testimonies. At a 1984 gathering in Cannes marking the 40th anniversary of D-Day, American and German veterans met in peace. Hans Weber, who had been a 19-year-old private in the 352nd Infantry Division, met Tom Patterson, who had carried a Thompson with the 29th Infantry Division. "I remember the sound," Weber said through a translator. "That rapid firing, like someone typing very fast. We were terrified of it." Patterson, then 60 years old, pulled out a photograph of himself from 1944 holding a Thompson. "This gun saved my life a dozen times, maybe more." Weber studied the photo, then said something that required no translation. "Chicago Typewriter." Both men laughed, but it was laughter tinged with memory of when that sound meant death. The production statistics, when fully analyzed, revealed the true scope of American industrial supremacy. In 1943 alone, American factories produced 577,880 Thompsons. That's more submachine guns in 1 year than Germany produced in the entire war. Each weapon came with 6 magazines, a cleaning kit, spare parts, and an instruction manual that German soldiers noted was better printed than most of their field manuals. The cost was equally revealing. Each Thompson cost the U.S. government $44 to produce by 1944, including profit margins for manufacturers. The German MP-40, using stamped metal and simplified construction, cost 24 Reichsmarks, but Germany couldn't produce them in sufficient quantities regardless of cost. America had proven that industrial abundance could overcome any amount of tactical sophistication. Former SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny, Hitler's commando leader, provided perhaps the most honest assessment in a 1960 interview. "We Germans excelled at war as an art. Careful planning, precise execution, professional skill. The Americans excelled at war as an industry, mass production, overwhelming firepower, mechanical solutions to tactical problems." The Thompson was perfect American weapon, crude by our standards, wasteful of ammunition, requiring no special skill, but there were millions of them, with billions of bullets, in the hands of soldiers who didn't need to be marksmen when they could simply destroy everything in front of them. The last combat use of Thompsons in Europe came during the crossing of the Rhine in March 1945. By then, German resistance was largely broken, but the weapon that had helped break it continued its deadly work. Sergeant Michael O'Brien of the 9th Infantry Division carried a Thompson across the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen. The Germans on the far side tried to set up defensive positions, he recalled. But by then, we'd been using these guns for 9 months. We knew exactly what to do: suppress, flank, overwhelm. The poor bastards didn't have a chance. In the Pacific Theater, the Thompson continued proving its worth against Japanese forces until the war's end. But it was in the hedgerows of Normandy where the weapon had made its most decisive contribution, where it had transformed from a gangster's gun into the tool that broke German defensive warfare. The Thompson's legacy lived on in unexpected ways. The weapon appeared in countless war films, usually depicted spraying bullets with characteristic sound. For German audiences, these scenes evoked visceral memories. Klaus Hoffmann, a Wehrmacht veteran, walked out of a screening of The Longest Day in 1962 when the Thompson sound effects began. "I couldn't listen to it," he explained. "That sound, it brought back too much." The very last Thompsons manufactured for military use rolled off the production line in February 1944. Auto Ordnance had already transitioned to producing the simplified M3 grease gun that would supplement and eventually replace the Thompson. But the 1.75 million Thompsons already produced would continue serving for decades, their reputation established forever in the hedgerows of Normandy. Which brings us back to Obergefreiter Franz Müller, the soldier we met in that hedgerow position outside St. Lo in June 1944. Müller survived the war, one of only 40 men from his original company of 180 to do so. Captured during the Falaise pocket collapse in August, he spent the remainder of the war in a POW camp in England. In 1974, Müller returned to Normandy for the 30th anniversary of D-Day. Standing in a preserved hedgerow position near St. Lo, he was interviewed by a BBC documentary crew. Asked about the weapon he most remembered from the fighting, his answer was immediate. The Thompson, Die Chicago Schreibmaschine, the Chicago Typewriter. He walked to the earthen embankment where he had once manned an MG-42, the weapon Germans called Hitler's buzzsaw, capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute. "We had the superior machine gun," he said, "but they had Thompson submachine guns everywhere. Every squad, sometimes every other man. In the hedgerows, their weapon was better. Not technically better. Better for this fighting." Müller paused, looking across the peaceful Norman field where he had once watched American soldiers advancing behind their curtain of automatic fire. "We were the professional soldiers, they were the amateur citizen soldiers, but they had the tools and the tactics and the ammunition. Most of all, they had the ability to adapt. We fought the way we were trained. They fought the way that worked." The interview ended with Müller making an observation that captured the entire lesson of the Thompson in Normandy. "We Germans were prepared to fight the last war better. The Americans were prepared to fight this war differently. Their Thompson submachine gun, which we mocked as a gangster weapon, was perfect for this war. It didn't require years of training. It didn't require special skill. It just required pulling the trigger and keeping it pulled while you advanced. Simple, brutal, effective, American." Standing in that Norman hedgerow 30 years after the battle, Franz Müller had finally understood what his younger self couldn't comprehend that June morning in 1944, when the Thompsons first opened fire. The gangster gun hadn't just killed German soldiers, it had killed the German way of war. Every burst of .45 caliber fire had been another nail in the coffin of tactical superiority, professional soldiering, and racial mythology. The Thompson submachine gun entered World War II with a Hollywood reputation and ended it as one of the most decisive infantry weapons of the conflict. In the hedgerows of Normandy, it had proven that American industrial democracy could arm its citizen soldiers with weapons that negated every advantage professional armies possessed. The Germans who had laughed at the Chicago Typewriter in June 1944 weren't laughing by August. They were running, surrendering, or dying. The Typewriter had written their defeat in lead, one burst at a time, and the story it typed across the Norman countryside was simple. In modern industrial warfare, the nation that could produce the most weapons and the most ammunition would prevail. The Thompson had typed that lesson into history with 1.75 million guns and 3.5 billion bullets, and every German soldier who heard its distinctive chatter in the hedgerows of Normandy knew they were hearing the sound of their empire's death rattle. If you've made it this far into this story, you understand the value of deep historical research and dramatic storytelling that brings World War II to life beyond the textbook facts. This channel is dedicated to uncovering these untold perspectives, the moments when enemy forces realized they were facing something beyond their comprehension. These aren't just war stories. They're human stories of how industrial might and innovation changed history. Subscribe to support this kind of detailed historical content and help these important stories reach more people who appreciate history told with the depth and respect it deserves.